The key to solving the missing Nancy Guthrie case might be on four wheels. That's right, the getaway car.
I don't think currently that the case is gone cold yet. It's much easier to find a car than it is a suspect, a la Brian Koberger, okay? You find the car, you find the suspect.
I have a very special guest on the program who deals in the world of cold cases. He's helped solve a lot of them, and he doesn't believe that the case of missing Nancy Guthrie is a cold case. He also believes that the key is in the getaway car. I ask him a lot of questions about this investigation, why he thinks that, and what the family may or may not know at this point in time. Is Savannah privy to information that we're not? Is she getting updates that we're not? He answers that question. He also talks about the fact that Savannah or Nancy might not have been the intended target. That's a fascinating part of the conversation as well. But first, do me a favor. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, and share this episode with a friend. Now, the case of missing Nancy Guthrie. So joining in the conversation to help break it all down, a very special guest. We have Chris McDonough, Cold Case Foundation, retired homicide detective, expert in criminal behavior analysis, director of law enforcement relations for the Cold Case Foundation, which is fascinating, and the host of a really good program that I need you guys to subscribe to, the Interview Room podcast and YouTube channel. I'll have all the details in my show notes. First off, thanks for joining me. And what are your initial thoughts on Nancy Guthrie? Is this a cold case?
First, thank you, Matt, for inviting me. And man, I'm so excited for your future here on YouTube. It's going to be pretty neat. So if we just kind of step back for a moment, right? I think we're like 85 days into this now, or thereabouts. And if we kind of step back and say, okay, are there things happening behind the scenes? I think that a reality of, a task force still being together would still tell us that they are operating with functional leads coming in. There's got to be something happening. Now, that could be a digital footprint. That could be, this idea that the DNA is coming back. But at this point, to answer your question, I don't think currently that the case is gone cold yet.
So it's really more they're keeping all their cards close to the vest.
Yeah, that's a great way. That's a great analogy. I believe that that's probably what's occurring here.
So, you deal with the world of cold cases. When you're not analyzing them, you've been working on them for years and years. So what are you waiting for? What's going to, perk up your ears? When are we going to have that moment?
Well, I think once the investigation gets to a place where they maybe don't have any scientific evidence or something to that effect, forensically, when an investigation gets to that point, then they typically run out of things to, think out of the box creatively, right? And this is why the first 24 to 48 hours is critical in any kind of these cases just before they go cold. Because then you can kind of, retread backwards and re-engineer, what you first saw, what the first investigator saw, what they heard, from the witnesses and the reporting parties. And they kind of retread through that information because statistically, you're going to find within the first 300 pages of an initial homicide investigation and or a missing person, that suspect potentially could be right under your nose right then and there.
So are we looking at a attempted burglary gone wrong? Are we looking at something that was an intended abduction? And how many suspects are you thinking we have?
Well, I don't think this is an intended burglary personally, based on my analysis of the case. I mean, if you look at the totality of the circumstances, Nancy Guthrie is an absolutely what we would call a low-risk victim. And what that means is everything indicates that, she's, in an environment, a situation, and a circumstance that is 100% low risk. Now, if you were to change that dynamic just one iota, i.e., let's say she was out of the house, down at a supermarket or a truck stop at 2:30 in the morning, that kind of situation, well, that elevates her risk. Okay, and so statistically, the lower the risk to the victim, then the higher the probability that the suspect has some type of association with that particular victim, meaning it's somebody in a circle or within a circle of those who are connected or close to her potentially, versus the other way. If it's a truck stop, then that is a higher probability that it's a stranger who is involved in that particular circumstance.
Yeah, and this is unique for a lot of reasons. First off, you have the daughter who's a celebrity, and then there's that whole factor, like, why was she targeted in the first place? It has to be something connected to Savannah, you would think. And Savannah believes that as well. How much does Savannah know? How much does the family know that is not being shared with us?
Well, that's a great question. The information that we have, obviously, that she shared recently on an interview were, some particular details that were presented to the public about the doors being propped open, those types of things. And her belief that the two original ransom notes were also, genuine in nature.
She was in tremendous pain. Her back was very bad. She was trying to, on a good day, she could walk down to the mailbox and get the mail, but most days not. So there was no wander off. And the doors were propped open.
Yeah.
And there was blood on the front doorstep. And the Ring camera had been yanked off.
Yeah.
And so we were saying, this is
do something.
This is not
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
This isn't, something is very wrong here.
Yeah.
It's surreal. How is it possible that we are having to make a video speaking to a kidnapper who took an 84-year-old woman in the dead of night in her pajamas with no shoes, without her medicine, this little person, and to beg for mercy.
Okay. The interesting thing about that, though, unfortunately, is we've not heard that from law enforcement. Okay. We've heard it from the family only. And so then you have to step back and say, okay, well, what are the other narratives that we've heard from law enforcement? And what are the narratives we've heard from, potentially the family, which could have been, told to them. And they, Savannah's just decided to put that out into the ether. Okay. But what we know is the timeline. We know that the narrative presented by the sheriff is a timeline that he gave us from a couple of different sources. One is the garage door. They had a data point, at 10:48 in the evening, and then it closed at 10:50, which is a 2-minute, data point. So that tells us they have some type of digital footprint in that circumstance. What he didn't share with us was the door information, how the suspects may or may not have gotten in, how the family even got in. And then we heard from Savannah on, her presentation to, her show, where she says, well, we thought it was a medical incident. Well, we've not heard that also from law enforcement. Okay. Because at that point, you have to really think critically and say, okay, well, wait a minute. If it was a medical incident, that means there's 2 911 calls. The first 911 calls would have come from Nancy herself at 2:30 in the morning, because she would have had to been the reporting party to say, I'm having a medical incident. Okay. And that type of information is verifiable almost instantaneously when the law enforcement got on the scene that next morning, where the family reported her missing. Okay. And so then the second 911 call then is the daughter who calls 911 and says, Mom is missing. We're at the house and we're searching for her. So both of those 911 calls, if they exist, have not been presented to the public. And that is a sticking point right now for people to speculate, unfortunately. But it is a logical, sequence that you would have to ask, as in curiosity, well, if it was a medical thing and that explains the doors being propped open, which was the belief Savannah had, or her sister, well, then who made the 911 call?
Well, I'm curious why they haven't been released yet. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that could be holding information back, that there could be something that they do not want the public to know yet, that, would have leaned more towards, okay, we need to look in this a little bit further and a little bit closer.
Let's watch a little bit of Savannah's interview, and I'll ask you some questions on the other side.
You bet.
How? Someone knows something, even if that something is someone's been acting strange for the last 7-8 weeks, even if it's just that. Somebody knows. Mm-hmm. And maybe somebody's afraid. And I understand that. But our hearts are in agony. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We can't breathe. We can't live. We can't go on. We can't be at peace. We can't go forward. We have to know what happened.
So is that a statement that, she did? That was a lengthy interview, we all know. But are these answers to these questions off the cuff for her? Or were they talked about with the FBI before she did the interview?
Well, there's a high probability that statement right there is scripted, meaning she's talking to the suspect. Note the fact that she says somebody knows, okay, but then she personalizes it. She says, I understand, okay, that someone is afraid, okay. Well, who's that someone that she's talking to, and how would she understand that? Okay, unless there's other information that's being held back, and that she is trying to figure out, okay, I'm trying to personalize my mother. I'm trying to personalize the individual that may have my mother. Okay, well, anybody who goes into a home at 2:30 in the morning and takes an 84-year-old woman, okay, and abducts her, and then evidence of hurting her, okay, there's not much empathy in that individual. And so the fact that she is leaning into this person, it helps me understand maybe that the behavior science unit, the BAU, is a little bit further behind the scenes here, writing some of that script that she's probably modified to her own presentation.
Yeah, talking points that she can remember, because it was a lot to go through that. And I know that you've sat down with many, many families dealing with a situation that's not pleasant, like this, like a case that you're working. So what else can you share, the behind the scenes that she and the rest of the family might be dealing with right now?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of pressure that takes place here in these types of cases, these high-profile cases. There's pressure from the investigators onto the investigators, and it comes from various different places, and that in of itself starts to press down into the family, okay? I can tell you high-profile cases that I've worked, I don't talk to the family personally. I assign somebody on my team, because we used to work in teams of 5 and 7. Okay, in a response to something like this. And coming from Southern California, as you know, more than anybody, we had a lot of volume. Okay, and we also had resources. So what we do is you assign somebody to that family, and then that liaison starts giving information to that family that starts to take some of that pressure off of, what's happening, can we ask? And you just have to be honest with a family because they're going through this stress of not knowing, the fear of, the worst case scenario. And, you just keep adding that on top of now they're getting notes saying mom is alive, okay, without saying it, by demanding money. And then the pushback to that is, okay, well, give us a proof of life. Okay? And then the FBI saying to you, look, we can't tell you to pay a ransom or a demand. That will never happen from a law enforcement agency. That is strictly a family decision. Okay? And if the family chooses to make that ransom payment, then that's up to them. Because we saw this guy who appeared, who showed up out of LA out of nowhere, who said, yeah, did you get the Bitcoin? And then, the FBI immediately were on top of that guy and they took him into custody. So the family is now weighing that stress and that pain. Okay. And then you have to step back and say, okay, well, we've got, as an investigator, we got to take the family out of the loop or keep them in the loop. I know that sounds crazy, but the reality of that is just what it is, And so what kind of actions did we see take place? They impounded the family, the daughter's car, okay? And they kept that into evidence. Well, why did they do that? Okay? They had to check a box to make sure there wasn't any evidence that was pointing towards that low risk victimology. Okay. They also searched their homes a couple of different times. Now imagine being the daughter of a missing woman, 84-year-old woman, and the police coming and saying, hey, we've got to impound your car. Okay. Well, why? Why are you impounding my car? What does that got to do with my mom missing? Well, there's a whole bunch of other stuff taking place over here and that they don't know about. And that's why it's critical, not as a case agent to engage yourself with the family and, not to be too critical of law enforcement in this one, but this is where the sheriff really made a big mistake, in my opinion. He should have never gone to the podium and pushed out as much information that he did, because in this world of new digital, age, instantaneously that information, was put into the ether, and it can backfire. And ultimately it did, because then they started looking into his background. And unfortunately, he's going to have to experience that himself now.
Yeah, a lot of people are questioning whether or not, he delayed or hurt the investigation in his initial response to it all. Do you think it's still on track?
I think the FBI has a clarity of focus. I wish their evidence response team had been in there earlier. But again, it's a jurisdictional thing that I think the public needs to continue to understand. She disappeared out of Pima County. Unless they can show some type of nexus for a federal investigation to completely take off and kick in, meaning if they have evidence that she crossed over, state lines, or it's gone to a foreign country or something like that, then the Pima County Sheriff's Department will continue to be the tip of the spear.
What are you watching for at this point in time? Do you think that it's the DNA that's going to crack the case? And why are the photos, not the video like we were told, why are the photos from the backyard taking so much time? Like, shouldn't they, if they know that they exist, why are they taking so long?
Well, there's a whole bunch of analysis taking place, right? And that digital footprint. Okay, but I think this case ultimately, hypothetically, is going to come down to the first 24 hours of who was interviewed and what they said, and the first 48 hours. Okay. And then, of course, the digital evidence comes in as kind of a reinforcement of, okay, we're on the right track here. Okay. Remember, I worked homicide for 13 years. We didn't have DNA, and we didn't have, all this electronics. All we had was the ability to walk up to people and sit down with them and say, so tell me what happened. Okay. And if we got an ABO blood typing from the lab, we were excited. Okay. Yay. The suspect has he's an O positive. Okay. Hypothetically. Right. And everybody went, all right, we're making progress. So I think it's going to come back down to, good old fashioned, gumshoe police work from the first 48 hours in this thing. And the sad part of that is they shut the scene down too rapidly to where, they could have had a lot more information, I think, maybe come in, and that may come back to bite them in the butt. But I remain optimistic for Savannah, and I remain optimistic for, those who are working really hard at this.
Me too, and it could happen at any moment that we hear details about the DNA and whether or not it's been put into CODIS, whether or not there's a hit. They say that there's a hair, maybe that'll lead somewhere. We know that the one glove didn't. Is this guy working alone?
In my opinion, no. There has to be at least two. And one of my colleagues on the Cold Case Foundation, Dr. Picato, describes it as a chef and two waiters on the porch, or a waiter on the porch serving the food. He thinks this guy's the waiter. I can't disagree with him. I think there's somebody, a little bit smarter behind the scenes on this one. The fact that the guy doesn't even know how to, carry a weapon. He's trying to use weeds, to either pretend or, pull a camera off of the door there. And if you go back to that one picture right there, Matt, again, that you just had up. Yeah, that one. Okay. It looks like he's looking to the left, through that side window there. But there was another YouTube channel that actually shows his pupils are focused on the camera itself. It was a reverse image that this individual did. It was brilliant. And you can clearly see the moment the suspect hits the porch, he's focused on that camera. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is if this guy and or somebody else, because there's two pictures, remember, there's another guy in the background standing back there in a second photograph that we don't know what the metadata is going to tell us when that picture was taken. But if this guy had previously surveilled this potential target, okay, wouldn't it be logical that he had seen that photograph or seen that camera before this particular night? So it causes you to think, well, wait a minute then, is this the same guy on the other photograph? Or if it is, why didn't he account for the camera on both opportunities that he was present at the residence? And so that also brings me, anyway, in my thought process, into a vehicle. That is the most risky type of event or tool to bring into an abduction, a car. It's much easier to find a car than it is a suspect, a la Brian Koberger, okay? You find the car, you find the suspect. So the fact that this guy may have driven, on the 24th, the 11th, and then the night of the abduction, a vehicle to take her out of the area, okay, that is a very high risk activity for this suspect, okay? And so most of these individuals like to lower their risk, okay? And so that tells us this guy or person, whoever it's going to be, is very comfortable, not only on that front porch, but he's comfortable in the area as a whole. That his car would not stick out if they saw it at 2:00 in the morning going by on a Ring camera, okay?
Do the neighbors need to worry? There's been some reporting about neighbors concerned, and not just from the so-called YouTube journalists and whatever's going on with some of them. I'll stay out of that. But, just in general, since we don't have a perpetrator, we don't have a person of interest, we don't have a suspect, should I be worried for my family if they're in the Catalina foothills?
That's an interesting question. If you're 84 and there's a series of abductions taking place in the Catalina foothills, the answer would be yes. But in this particular scenario, those statistics do not exist. Okay? This is like, so it is so rare that even the scientists, the data scientists, are going, we've never seen something like this. Okay. Now, statistically, if you're elderly, there's a higher probability that other things, you could be a victim of a crime. So lock your doors, lock your windows, always keep, there's a saying in Hawaii, be akamai, which means just pay attention, to what's going on around you. And as long as you're doing that, I think you're going to be very, very safe. So I don't think there's a danger to that particular, neighborhood as a whole, personally.
So give me your best summary or guesstimate on the motive here. So, we have a woman who's 84. She doesn't fit any sort of profile that's typical, right? So, I mean, we have the Savannah Guthrie factor, but she doesn't live there. So why her?
Yeah, great question, right? I mean, and why, if you're trying to get back at Savannah, are you living vicariously by taking her mom, out of the house? Because now you have to manage her, to keep her alive. She's got health issues. What is that going to do to Savannah, right? If we think of an obsession in that lane, somebody's obsessed with Savannah, so therefore I'm going to go kidnap her mother, okay, and keep her, for himself or whoever, okay, just to get back at Savannah, that doesn't make sense, okay? So then we have to say, okay, then who would do this to an 84-year-old woman? And statistically, the SA, problem comes in, the assault situation with, I think we can all figure out what the S stands for, okay? And so statistically, though those individuals commit those acts in the home with the victim and they keep them there, okay? Again, lowering the risk, okay, to the suspect. So now once you add the dynamic of removing a victim from the home with all of these other health issues, okay, then you have to start looking at secondary potential motives. Who has something to gain? Could it be financial? Could it be influential? Could it be, hey, I'm mad at somebody else in your family and I live nearby them, so therefore I'm angry at them and I'm taking it out on their mother, okay, i.e. Annie, okay, because Annie did me wrong, okay? And so therefore that's one dynamic people aren't thinking about. We're only talking about Savannah, okay? Maybe it's actually Annie that they're angry at. Maybe they're angry at Cameron, okay? Maybe there's a financial circumstance behind the scenes that nobody knows about, that we don't know about, that somebody feels slighted. Maybe the pool guy, hey, you haven't done A, B, C, or D, which you said you were, therefore I'm going to take it out on your mom. Maybe it's, the guy who cleaned the HVAC system, people that may have stayed or friends, on the property at some point. We just don't know. The situations are endless, to be honest with you. And that's why it's critical when you first sit down in the first 24, 48 hours to say, okay, give me a list of your top 3 individuals. This is what I do anyway, and others. Give me a list of your top 3 to 5 individuals you believe who are capable of this particular problem. And then you would want the family to write those 3 to 5 people out. And then you go in, do everything that you can in what we call a suspectology, and you start breaking down the patterns of life within inside of those individuals on that particular list. And you'll be surprised what starts to come to the surface.
Yeah, and that's probably what we can hope is happening behind the scenes to lead to more interviews, to lead to more answers, and hopefully soon. But maybe she wasn't even ever the target.
And that's a possibility as well. But the burglars don't go into homes and not steal things. Okay. Burglars don't go into home and steal people. Okay. So there had to be a thought process and a planning process to know for a fact that this 84-year-old woman was going to be in that home at a particular time. And then we start hearing this narrative that the back door, that she had a habit of leaving her back doors open. I questioned that at 84 years old with 4 lock mechanisms on the front door. She's got 2 deadbolts and two twist locks, and she's got this big grate on the front of her house. And then you go to the look in the back doors, she also has 2 lock mechanisms, a deadbolt and a twist lock on just the doors you can visibly see. So for an 84-year-old woman who is, her husband passed away years ago, to kind of say, well, her pattern of life is to leave her doors open, I question that personally. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense at all. But, and both of us have worked close to the US-Mexico border for a long time in our careers. What's the likelihood that this was something to do with a cartel or something to do with organized crime? And then maybe that led to the misidentity and capturing the wrong victim.
Well, I think the cartels are sitting back going, don't bring us into this. We have nothing to do with it. Because, we have so many other problems, that the last thing we want is to manage an 84-year-old woman with health issues, and they would probably shoot the 3 or 4 people that were involved in this if that was the case, and then tell you where her body was at this point. Just to show good faith.
That's the other $1 million question, literally, is, where is she? Dead or alive? Like, how come, where could she be? And then also, it's kind of surprising that no one has ratted out the suspects.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. I mean, really, it's because, I think logic tells us that she's not going to be far and she's in the desert somewhere. Nearby in the Tucson area. I mean, that desert, Tucson alone has, 400 plus, unsolved homicides in their cold case squad. So it's not very hard to dispose of a body. And now that we're 84 days into this, wherever the animals are involved in this at this point, what you'll find is probably her clothing, and it's going to be a hiker. Typically, coming by. Statistically, it's probably just what we call a body dump, right? And meaning the suspect is not going to take time to bury her unless there was a circumstance that they had scoped out right away, a particular geographic region where they wanted to put her. But if she was alive for 24 to 48 hours, typically what you would see is immediately the suspect wants to just dispose of the remains, because at that point, they're dealing with 150 pounds of concrete. That's the other thing that people forget, that when somebody passes away, their body becomes very heavy, and that becomes, again, a manageable, problem for the suspect. And so this is why, if you have cars, if they've impounded cars, what do you think one of the most logical things to take out of a vehicle, not thinking about the electronics piece here, right? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but, critically thinking, right? I'll give you the answer real fast. It's the air filter in the vehicle, right? Because that air filter captures pollens and all kinds of dust and air and all of that stuff. Well, you can match that to a dump site if you find a body. Okay. I've had cases where they've been dumped up in the mountains. Victims have been dumped in the mountains, and we've sent botanists in to collect all the vegetation around where the victim was found. And then you take the air filter out of the car, and then you scientifically, you can see if that vegetation is consistent with maybe the air or the molecules and all the product that blows into that air filter. And I've literally thrown on the desk to a person saying, well, can you explain how your air filter got the same, molecules around where the body was? And
well, that is awesome. I never even thought of that. And that really like nails someone to a crime, but you have to find the body first. So how do we do that?
Great question. You have to be willing to allow additional searches, and you not just wait. Okay, you have that digital footprint now that they're working on, probably because they took down 2 cars. The first one was I think it was a DoorDash driver, and the second one, we don't know why they took that guy down yet, but they impounded his car. Okay, so I could tell you if I was a case agent, the first thing I'd say is grab that air filter. Okay, throw it in a bag. Okay, and throw it to Quantico, and let them get a botanist in there and tell us what kind of molecules are in there, because you can actually DNA plants as well, and you can match them. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of other sciences that take place behind the scene that just because somebody says I wasn't there or I don't know what you're talking about, that could take a little more time to scientifically connect those dots. Okay, so those are the kind of things where you want to let searchers get back out into the desert and start looking.
Well, I've never really heard that stuff before. And I think that that's why people really love your show and your insight and hearing you speak on subjects like this. Do you think that Savannah also comes from Court TV? Do you think that, they're telling her stuff like this if they're coming across it, or do you think that they don't share that stuff with her?
Yeah, I don't think they share it with her, but not because they don't want to. It's because, it's her mom. Okay. And, you don't want to add, again, you don't want to have that additional stress into the family. Although, you have to be honest with them. You have got to be honest with them. And that's where, assign somebody to work as a liaison with the family. And then you tell that liaison, okay, here's what I can tell you about the progress that we're making, but you can't tell the family, or you can tell this piece of the puzzle. And the reason for that is the defense is going to put Savannah on the stand with the rest of the family, right? They're going to put them up there, and one of the first questions they're going to say is, what did the police tell you? One of the first questions they're going to ask. And you've seen this a 1,000 times, being the great journalist that you are. Okay. And just look over his shoulder, everybody. Look at all those awards. He's amazing. Okay. And so that idea, you've got to protect the family, even though it feels like, the cops are being, selfish and they don't want to tell. No, it's actually a preservation for the family, because when the defense is done with them and they say no further question, the first question they're going to ask the case agent is, what did you tell the family?
Yeah. And, hopefully in doing these reports, maybe it'll get the case out there more, and hopefully this family gets answers soon. Chris, thank you so much for your time. You are so fascinating to talk to. I could just hear you speak all day. And you know what, everyone, just go to the Interview Room podcast and YouTube channel. That's where you can check that guy out. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that the next time we talk, it's actually after the family has some sort of answers in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. And thank you so much. It's been a delightful opportunity to be here.
Let's keep Nancy and the Guthrie family in our thoughts and prayers. And if you have any information in this case, please call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Even the slightest detail that you might not have reported or that you didn't think was a big deal could crack the case wide open, including if there was an unusual car near Nancy's home that you noticed. That's going to do it for this episode. Take care of yourself. We'll see you next time.